The intro welcome back.
Welcome back.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's set to
Wonderful.
auto advance. So,
Cool. Oh, and this will let me
and you can
refocus.
stream that. Yeah, there's also there's two groups spinning up here at RDA. One's on health data. There's one.
I know. What a nice surprise.
There's two groups spinning up.
No, it's fine.
One on health data and another on security. And they're having their first meetings. I mean, they had sort of pre-launch meetings, but they're having their first meetings here this week. I'll be in on both of those. There's also another meeting that is co-hosted by our group, and we've got a meeting. There's another group, another meeting on protecting confidential information that is organized by George Alter and myself. So we'll be. I'll touch base with you on some details of those three meetings because I know you can be interested.
And one of the things that I'm trying to stay close to the way that is non-health data, but outside the regulatory threshold is increasing. It's something that a lot of people in health data really either sort of care about health data, just like outside the health data.
Right.
You do really big bad things to treat it.
What about with things like there's some interest here.
Out of your due diligence.
There is some interest in these topics. Really, I mean, it's yes, it's health data. However,
They're like, wow.
Check 1, check 2. Handheld 18. Check 2. Handheld 20. Check 1, check 2. Lavalier 19.
But you have to, you can't sort of think of the simple source of data as the answer. It's the cost of living using Bayesian systems. And people,
Oh, okay, right. Yes. Any other logistical details? Restrooms are down the hall. Lunch is here. Drinks are here. There's no one else down here. Ooh, actually, no, you're good. I don't think it's a good idea for you to be the one running around. I'll talk to you later.
Handheld 18, check.
Test, test. 1, 2, 3, test, test. I'm so excited to be here today. Yes, yes, yes. Sunday morning. Woohoo! All good?
Bring it up.
Okay, oh, good.
All right. Good morning, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute. But we've had a couple questions about the Wi-Fi, which is always an important question. The answer is yes, we do. The network is Sheraton Meeting. and the password is NISO16. It's not case sensitive as I understand, so everyone should be able to get logged on. Yes. Hi. Yes. Oh, it's okay. Let's chat during the break, okay? Everything's fine. I just wanted to get... All right. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Todd Carpenter. I'm the Executive Director of NISO, the National Information Standards Organization. I'm so glad that you all could join us on this Sunday morning. And before I get started, I want to remind, or at least inform everyone, if you're not aware, we are live streaming this event. So that creates a couple logistical challenges. First of all, we want to make today a very interactive conversation. This isn't, I mean, in part we're here to learn, in part we're here to also engage and discuss what we'd like to see come out of this session. So from that perspective, I want all of you to be engaged in those conversations, but I'd like you to be engaged in those conversations with a microphone. So Nettie's got one. We'll be spending a good chunk of the day in discussion sessions. So if you'd like to say something, please, and I'd love all of you to say lots of things, please raise your hand. We'll run a mic to you. So that everyone who's listening can, or watching, or looking at the recording can hear you saying what you're saying. Before we begin, one of the challenges of running an organization and planning meetings like this is the calendar. And in looking at this event, it made sense that we not overlap too much with the other parts of International Data Week. And we certainly didn't want to conflict with any of the actual program. And we also didn't want to have this at the end after everyone had gone home. But unfortunately, that means that we've sort of hit upon an unfortunate historical day. So I'd like to take a moment just to reflect on the fact that it is 9/11, and just take a brief moment of silence to reflect on the sort of horribleness of that day, as well as the horribleness that ensued in the subsequent years, and reflect on the thousands of people who've lost their lives either on today, 15 years ago, or subsequently. So just a second. So thank you for that. Interestingly, 10 years ago I started at NISO as executive director, and NISO held a meeting 3 weeks after I started, which is never a good idea, to have a meeting that quickly after you started an organization, which actually happened here in Denver. At the Magnolia Hotel, a couple blocks from here, which is just close to where my hotel is. So every day, yesterday and today, I walk by the Magnolia and I kind of reflect on what's happened in those 10 years and the changes within our organization, and the expansion of the scope of the things that we do. NISO as an organization has existed for, coming up on 80 years. And we were deeply embedded in the library community and have sort of grown in our scope and in our communities that we engage in. About a year after I got started, I got a grant from, NISO got a grant from the Mellon Foundation. And part of that grant was to do some thought leader meetings. And one of those meetings was actually on research data and the challenges of research data and the standards related to research data. And I remember Cliff Lynch, who's the executive director of CNI, the Coalition for Networked Information, during that meeting actually said, you know, NISO doesn't have any history or reputation or involvement in research data, and you should tread carefully here. And kind of took that to heart in terms of what NISO's role, community was, is, what it could be. And in part, that's over the years developed into kind of deeper involvement in the Research Data Alliance, deeper engagement with, say, the different communities involved with research data and sharing. And this effort now, and the leadership that NISO is playing in this particular area, is a sort of evolution, a continued evolution of NISO's role in the research data community and support for the standards necessary for data sharing, particularly in the library community, but also its involvement in the publishing process and scholarly communications. And so I expect over time NISO will continue to move in that direction and continue to develop as we move forward. So just to kick, by way of a bit of an introduction, just wanted to make those few remarks. And then I got some more formal remarks about this group and this meeting, which apologies in advance. I'm like Mac native, and it has been years since I've used a PC, so if I fumble in front of you, it's all because I'm more of a Jobs computer person than a Gates computer person. So let's see if we can make this happen. We can. Very quickly, how many of you are familiar with NISO? Anyone not? I see a couple hands didn't go up. Excellent. That's actually not a bad thing. I usually spend a lot of time talking to publishers and librarians who are very familiar with NISO. We are an ANSI-accredited standards developer in the space of information distribution. So we work with publishers, libraries, and information providers to develop technical standards for the distribution of information. What are technical standards for distribution of information, you might ask? If you think back to the old days of libraries, card catalogs, the information that created card catalogs was developed from a NISO standard, Z39.2, which was a standard for bibliographic information. So we also develop things like identifiers, things you might be familiar with. The DOI is a NISO standard. The ISSN number for publications. We work with the ISBN number for books. So identifiers is a big part of our space. We do information exchange, so how library systems interact with publisher systems, on authentication, on file formats, and things along those lines. We are a volunteer organization. We're a nonprofit, so 501c3. We've got about 200 members. We've got about 400 people who work on NISO projects at any given time. So we're really volunteer driven. And I imagine everyone here is familiar with the Research Data Alliance. Yes? Anyone not? Okay. That would be an odd thing if you weren't familiar with RDA, being at an RDA meeting. So, privacy is a large issue from a variety of perspectives, and we're all familiar with our dear friend Mark Zuckerberg and his perspectives on privacy. That he recently said that if he were going to redesign, if he was starting Facebook from scratch, he would start with the perspective that all information that you put into Facebook should be open versus private. So and within those industries, so within industries that are primarily driven by advertising, there is a bias towards openness. And there's a belief, or at least a stated belief, that we don't care about privacy, that we want to share everything. But I really don't think that's true. People really do care about privacy, and they have very nuanced ideas about privacy. This is some information from a Pew Research study on privacy from 2015. And I realize it's hard to see. We'll be posting all of the slides and the presentations to the NISA website probably this afternoon so that you can all take a look at them. But the percentage of adults who care deeply about being in control of the information that they have, being able to share, being able to limit who they share information with, these are all critically important, and I think this goes to the heart of and belies the point that Zuckerberg and the advertising industry try to make. People really do care about privacy a lot. And yet, the number of the number of people who use Facebook, the number of people who use Fitbits and other personal data sharing, data gathering tools is on a rapid upswing. So how do we as a community deal with these tensions, with the ever-increasing amount of data collection that is possible, with the notion that we really should care, and we do care, about privacy? We all worry about privacy. We all, there isn't a day that goes by that there isn't some information about a data release or a hack or something. And it's kind of envision some guy standing on a corner going, hey, you want some social security numbers? You want some credit card numbers? I think there's probably a marketplace in Russia somewhere where you can buy just about any information about anyone you want, which is really frightening. And NISO comes at this because we are deeply embedded in the library community. The library community has been deeply involved with privacy since the 1930s, because the library community had to react to during World War I, actually, people were imprisoned for their information search behavior. So you were interested in, what's going on in Germany? Well, so if you're looking up what's going on in Germany and the history of the German Reich, well, that must mean, or I'm sorry, not the Reich, that was predated the Reich, say Kaiser Wilhelm. Well, then you must have some affinity to Germany, and so you must be a traitor, and so you very likely might be a problem. You were a person of interest who the government would then arrest based on your library search behavior. So the library community, this is a third element of the ALA Code of Ethics, which talks about intellectual freedom. And it's a core element of what it means to be a librarian, to adhere to the principles. And intellectual freedom and privacy, protection of privacy is core to that. And in a context where this is our traditional view of a library, that's an important element, but increasingly the library looks more and more like this in the back end. more and more content is available digitally. More and more of your interaction with the library and information services at your institutions are taking place on a computer network, which is constantly tracking your behavior, which is constantly tracking what you're reading, what sites you're visiting. I mean, it may or may not, it has the capability to do that. NISO got involved in these questions, I mean, deeply involved in these questions, following a revelation that Adobe Digital Editions, which is a digital rights management system, was tracking users' library content and then sending that information back to central servers so that it knew what you were reading and then also could provide digital rights access to that content. But they were doing it and sharing that information through an unsecured, just plain old HTTP communication methodology, which isn't secure at all. And anyone who was sniffing your that network traffic could see exactly what was in your collections. Now this is just kind of bad programming, basically. But it highlighted to the library community the challenge of all of this data that is being exchanged back and forth and how that data is available or not, protected or not, and how in this digital environment the library community in particular should step up its game, so to speak. There's also a challenge there, and this I think applies to any information in organization, of weighing the benefits of analyzing information, analyzing personal information, analyzing usage data, analyzing user behavior in order to gain insights. And how do you balance that nuanced question of privacy versus benefit? So could we build, and this is what NISO eventually headed in the direction of, could we build a framework that allowed for this usage, allowed for the achieving the benefits of using this information while simultaneously recognizing the privacy questions and the privacy needs and nuances? So in 2014, we launched a project to develop a framework for the library community on patron data and information systems with some generous funding from the Mellon Foundation, with a goal of establishing a consensus set of principles around how to use patron information in a library context. And we ended that project in December of last year with the publication of this consensus principles on research data. Now, this is a kind of long-winded background information for how we got here, because at the time that we had made our initial proposal to the Mellon Foundation, they had an interest and were aware of the challenges of research data and wanted NISO to do a joint project that focused on patron information in the library community and the research data interests challenges with privacy and research data at the same time. Realistically, those are two totally different communities. Well, 90% different communities. There are, certainly information professionals and libraries and publishing issues, et cetera, that are related, but they're very different questions. And this was, the patron privacy problem was challenging enough within the context of simply the US community and the publishing community, without opening up all of the challenges that this project we found envisioned would entail, where RDA is an international organization, so that opens up all of the legal issues between the differences in EU privacy law versus US privacy law or state law, et cetera, as well as the very nettlesome problems around research data. So we said to the Mellon Foundation, we'll do one, we'll do the other, we'll do them in sequence rather than in parallel. And I'm glad we did, because the patron privacy project turned out to be a lot more challenging than we had expected. And it highlighted how much more difficult this project probably will be in moving forward. So there's this perception of big data and privacy, and there's sort of an awkwardness of the relationship between those two things. But it is, I think, indisputable that there is tremendous value in sharing of research data, and we want to encourage that. But there are these ancillary issues around research data sharing that we as a community need to address. Some of them are systems issues, some of them are, say, metadata issues, access issues, security issues, but privacy is a significant barrier in some areas, in many areas, that kind of fits into the grand vision of RDA as issues that we as a community need to address. Because it became very clear, or has been very clear for the community for a very long time, about the issues and challenges, particularly coming out of the health data. This is an article from 2013 in Nature, that it wasn't a question of when the big genome data breach was going to happen, but not a question of if, but when. Get my wording straight. That it was going to happen. That is the point at which we start gathering genomic information, is the point at which someone is going to find an interest in accessing it and using it for less than idealistic research purposes. And there are potentially large costs. In 2014, Columbia University in New York Presbyterian had a data breach of only 6,800 names, 6,800 records. And they were forced to pay almost $5 million in restitution for that. So the potential for damages, real significant financial damages in this space, are huge. And it touches on, not just the obvious domains of health data, but things that you might not necessarily think of as private information, like transportation, political science, computer and network behavior, engineering, especially with the Internet of Things. If you start thinking about all of the opportunities for data collection around every object that you have that is connected to the internet and the amount of data that could be generated from all of that, you start getting into huge privacy issues. And privacy sits in a weird place. There are security issues which are related to privacy. There are ethical issues which are related to privacy. But not all ethical issues are privacy issues. Not all security issues are privacy issues. Not all data sharing is inappropriate. Not every privacy issue is a hack. There are legal issues surrounding sharing of research data. And so privacy sort of sits in the middle of this Venn diagram. And one of the reasons that we proposed this interest group was while there was a legal interoperability group and an ethics group and some metadata groups that were talking about some of these issues, there wasn't a group that was specifically focused on research data, or specifically focused on privacy and its issues with research data, which is what we were trying to address. Again, I want to thank, when we started to talk about this idea, and again, this sort of developed out of conversations with the Mellon Foundation. The Sloan Foundation was also very interested and involved in the Research Data Alliance, and they see the value and the importance of this effort. So Both Mellon and Sloan have been funding this work for the next a little more than a year to get us off the ground. And they've also supported this meeting, so many thanks to them for bringing us together. Within the context of the Research Data Alliance, and I know many of you have heard me talk about or participated in the plenary group that we had in Tokyo, this began through a birds of a feather, which is a RDA structure, to get people together and talk about an issue. We hosted a meeting, organized a meeting on March 9th during, I think it was P6, P5, in San Diego. We had about 18 people in the room. We had to switch because of some switch time, so I think the attendance was a little depressed. But 18 people talking about privacy was a good start. And we spent that time talking about sort of what would a working group or an interest group in RDA look to or address. And these are some of the topics that they identified during that conversation. So there was, obviously a research data set that had personally identifiable information in it. This usually went through an IRB process, but it either how do you strip out that information? How do you anonymize it? Data sets that don't necessarily on their own contain personally identifiable information, but when merged with other data sets, you could key off and identify people based on sort of merging multiple data sets. And how do we deal with historical information that, say, contains personally identifiable information that is, we presume that everyone from a 19th century medical facility has passed away, so we don't have to worry about their privacy, right? But then you combine that with, say, genealogical information, and you can make inferences about people who are living today and their privacy. Especially if you infer a sort of genetic relationship behind some disorders or things along those lines. How do you deal with security issues and the replication of data sets in multiple repositories was another issue. The lack of metadata around privacy data sets, and how do we address that? So we decided to organize this interest group, and then that's the point at which we're kind of moving forward to today. We want to organize this interest group to look at the privacy implications of sharing research data sets, develop a framework for researchers and administrators about how to handle these questions. What are some of the questions and how do we handle some of them? Develop a modest set of metadata that can be used to describe things like, say, minimum viable consent, and how do you describe that? How do you describe the provenance implications related to privacy? So this was developed in Germany. This data set came out of Germany, so it has particular legal constraints. We want to create a bibliography, so a centralized resource for privacy-related information and literature, as well as just build awareness in the community about privacy issues and research data, and support, where appropriate, other groups who are working on related information. So these are the outcomes. We're hoping to develop a framework at a high level. We want to provide some information about international data exchange, but we obviously don't want to create a 300-page legal tome about the differences between privacy in different areas. So where is that value point of providing enough information but not overwhelming people, and also not engaging, say, teams of lawyers to write briefs on these things? Could we build in definitions for appropriate terms, or agree on common definitions, because different communities have different definitions for some of the key terminology in our space? Could we outline some use cases for how the framework that we're describing could be used and how do we apply it. Identify some variances in international law that might be appropriate or need more consideration. Again, the metadata, the bibliography, and the promotion. And so there's a couple different working groups within RDA that are taking place here this week. Here's a list of just some of the relevant organizations within RDA, as well as some of the organizations outside of RDA that are doing or are active in the space of research data and privacy. And we don't want to be duplicative of those efforts, but try and use this as a forum to bring those conversations together. For those of you who will be here all week, there's a number of relevant privacy meetings on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. I will be at most of them. Hope you can join us. The main meeting of this group is on Thursday at 2 o'clock. I think here in this, in Tower Court A. So a couple quick points before I wrap up. What do we want to do? Where are we moving forward? I was hoping to have our formal case statement approved by the Technical Advisory Board of RDA. Unfortunately, we kind of missed one point. We didn't have enough we didn't have any international chairs. I think we've kind of addressed that problem, and I hope by the end of the week we'll be able to say to TAB, yes, we've got international leadership. We've started building out the bibliography, although it's very limited. If any of you got the email, it's I think only about 20 items in there, not even. And we're in the process of, and during the meeting on Friday, we'll be talking about organizing the task groups that will actually do some of this work. So what we wanted to get done today, this symposium is a big kickoff for this working interest group. What we want to do today is engage you all in a conversation about these issues. So this is a brief outline of the agenda. If you didn't get a copy, there's one outside, or it's available on our website. We'll have a great keynote, and then what I'd like to do is not have this session be, let's sit and listen to experts and learn, strictly speaking, but take that learning and move beyond and have discussions about what's being discussed, what was presented, and how we can apply it. How we can take some of these ideas and do something about it. Move the issues forward in the community and try and find some solutions to some of the kind of vexing questions that we're going to talk about today. So every one of the talks will be followed by a discussion session. And I'd like you to keep a focus on discussion. We want to record what we're doing here. There's a couple people who are members of the group who volunteered to write about some of these topics and ideas, report back to the working group, but also communicate that out to various blogs and communicate to the community about what we're doing and disseminate some of these ideas. But also bring that back to the interest group and say, listen, this is what came out of the symposium, and here's some of the key topics that we want to focus on, that we should be focusing on. And build, ideally, at the end of the day, have an action item list for the interest group to say these are the things that either the interest group or the interest group in partnership with other interest groups should do about moving some of these issues forward. So we really want this, we could do a webinar with John and Christoph and me talking about these issues and kind of get information out. But the real value of bringing people together is to talk and to engage each other about these ideas. And that's what we really want to do today. So again, please use the microphones. If any of you are on Twitter or if you are watching the live stream and want to engage, we'll be monitoring the sort of Twitter sphere. NISO RDA privacy, or also use the RDA P8 hashtag. As I mentioned, we're live streaming this. We're also recording it so that you can listen to the recording at any given time. this is the URL for the bibliography. If you have any ideas about things that should go into that, just either join the bibliography or email them to us and we'll get them in. We are also, what we hope to do, Bonnie, is going to organize sort of live meeting notes. And we'll post, as soon as we get this up, a bit.ly of a short URL for that Google Doc. So you all can go in and engage in that sphere as well. Do we?
We do have a bit of so everyone, I'm Bonnie Serena, I'm the co-chair with Todd. I'm a researcher at the Data Society. I'll be talking a little bit later today.
Here,
But, we did create.
Mike.
So if you're. It should come, it'll come on in. Okay. Okay. All right, I'll just talk. So if you're following that hashtag on Twitter, I put the link for the bit.ly link for our shared notes. If not, and you just want the URL, it's just bit.ly /2CVUXP3, all lowercase. Do you want to add that on your notes?
If you sign in to Bitly, you can also get a custom.
Yeah, I didn't sign in. I was trying to do this quickly, but I can make a custom.
I'll make sure that that gets, I'll get that into the rolling in between slide decks. So that exists, and we'd like, kind of use that as a centralized place to capture some of the talk. So I realize that I've gone over by a few minutes because, yeah, I just did. Typical first meeting. Does anyone have any questions, comments before we delve in? If not, yeah, sure.
Right at the,
It's on.
is it my, okay, I'm being heard all right, okay, great. So right at the, so I'm Paul Burton from the University of Bristol in the UK. Right at the start, you were showing those, those bar charts that were talking about how strongly people felt about privacy. One of the things that I've noted is, is that there's two dimensions to how strongly people feel about it. First of all, they may feel, sorry, they feel very strongly that they should have control. And for example, I feel very strongly that I should have, that people shouldn't just be allowed to do what they want with my data. But on the other hand, I have a very high tolerance of quite a lot of things they could do with it. So it seems to me that there's the two dimensions on whether you feel strongly about the control per se and how you are then going to react in a conservative or radical way in relation to that. What was there any information in relation to that coming from that particular bit of data, do you know, at work?
There is how people feel about research, how people feel about data is very nuanced. It goes a lot towards how much you trust the organization that you're providing the information to. And I think in general, the community, the worldwide population tends to trust the research community, that the research community, you know, I'm willing to give my data for some health survey, generally, because they see some positive social benefit to doing so. I think what we need, the part of the value of this group is A, to reinforce that, B, to communicate to the world that we do care and establish some baseline of why we care, and these are the things that we're going to do. And the third element of the benefit of this project is to say, if there's a breach, well, okay, well, yes, there might have been a breach, but in general, these are the protocols that we follow, and we're trying as best we can. And, you know, sometimes if a breach happens, you can say, well, we've done X, Y, and Z. We've thought a lot about this, and a breach happened anyway, and maybe we need to adjust our framework slightly. But the principles are there, and we're trying to do our best, which is different from, say, other communities who are just, we don't care, you know, everything should be open. And so this is, I think, a part of the process of trying to reinforce the scholarly commitment. Yeah, so.
There's equally a nuanced perspective in the other direction as well. And there are some people who feel that there's nothing rational to discuss, that basically you've got to have this approach to controlling the data, and we don't want to discuss that any further. And so basically I think I'm 100% behind what you're saying, and I think that trying to maintain that nuanced position in the middle is really crucial, and trying to inform that is very important.
Right, especially in the context of the purpose of Research Data Alliance is to encourage worldwide sharing of research data. That there are definitely benefits, novel discoveries that are possible here, and how can we do so in as reasonable a manner as possible. And I know John needs to take off. He's got to catch a flight, so I don't want to dig too much more into his time or, you know, backtrack our agenda for the rest of the day. So I'd like to welcome our keynote speaker, John Wilbanks, who's the Chief Commons Officer at Sage Bionetworks. He's done a lot of work and thought in the space of openness and sharing, and is currently in a position of having to wrestle with some of these issues. I thought he would be a fantastic keynote speaker for us today. So, John, I'm going to turn it over to you. Just quick, is that mic live? No. The one on the podium. Okay. So you can use that podium mic.
Great.
Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Okay, this is the joy of, can I make PowerPoint work on a Mac, on Mac? Okay. Hi, it's great to see so many old friends here today. Hi, Chris, I didn't get to say hi. And to everyone on the live stream, thanks for watching. So this is the question I was assigned when I was asked to do the keynote, and I will not lie that my first reaction was not to say yes, because this is a tough question, right? So can we simultaneously support privacy and research? And the reason I was tempted to run away is that, at least in my own work, it's pretty clear that neither privacy nor research are stable concepts at the moment. And maybe they've never been. Arguably, they've never been. But the fact that these are not stable concepts is becoming more and more evident. And in many ways, talking about privacy or research as unitary things is a big part of the problem. So I'm going to run through a little bit of why I think this and show some examples in the spirit of openness. I'm going to show you some data about me that is not publicly available until now. So raise your hand if you had this as a sentence you thought you would read in 2016. Right? It's literally, the words don't make sense 4 months ago, right? Niantic was not a company very many people knew about, unless you were a really big GPS geek. Pokemon Go was not a game. But when Pokemon Go came out, and I play it with my 5-year-old son, we started playing it primarily to get him ready to go out and walk around in the heat on vacation. So playing Pokemon Go in a Washington, D.C. summer is pretty good training for going on hikes, actually. But in the beginning, the terms of service were so broad that they requested access to read all of your Google Mail. And it doesn't appear that this was intentional. Like, we don't know whether or not the goal was to allow the NSA to harvest our locations as well as sentiment mine our Gmail. But the default position of a lot of developers is to just grab everything you can and figure it out later whether or not you can monetize it. And so, you know, Senator Al Franken which is still a phrase that cracks me up as a Saturday Night Live fan, wrote this letter to Pokemon about privacy. And it's a good example of, we don't really know what privacy means when we talk about it. We just know that it feels creepy when we think it's been violated. I saw this on an ad as I was coming into Denver yesterday. I couldn't get a picture because we were going too fast. It was crowdsource, give us your most embarrassing statement. And I loved this. I didn't get a photograph, but my car knows I listen to my wife's playlist. Right? These are, again, it's not a statement that I would have even known how to make sense of a couple of years ago. But it's an example of the creeping influence of technology and its ability to track us and know what we're doing. So the car wouldn't have known if I pushed my analog radio to my wife's radio station. But because we've computered everything, these things that used to be sort of private bohemian things about our life are becoming tracked. And that begins to allow more and more accurate profiling of us. And in a lot of ways, privacy is sort of intersectional, right? I think Todd covered this with this concept of the different things that intersect to form privacy. And the attack on privacy in many ways is also intersectional. And I'm not lightly using the language of gender and race, but it's a language of power, which I think makes it an appropriate framework to think about some of these things. Because it's not just credit cards and their tracking, or supermarket loyalty cards, or social networks, or mobile phones with ubiquitous sensors. It's the way these things come together. And what's happened is, in the search of solving the advertising efficiency problem, which is, Tim O'Reilly calls it the Wanamaker problem. Right? I know that half of my ads work, but I don't know which half. And in the service of making advertising better, we've taken data from all of these things and combined them into smaller and smaller sets of demographic niches in which only a small subset of people exist, so that we can sell through automated auctions advertising space on screens. Right? And my favorite term for this is surveillance capitalism, and that's sort of where we're at. So this is, as of this morning, what Axiom, which is one of the major data aggregators, thinks it knows about me. And so my birth date is revealed here. I'm not too worried because Google, Twitter, and Facebook all revealed my birthday this year on social systems. But it's guessing that I'm male, Caucasian. It thinks I went to graduate school, which is awesome because I just have an undergraduate degree. It thinks I'm professional and technical, which is okay. It had inferred that I was single, so I edited that so I don't get into trouble. And it thinks I'm a Democrat, right? So this is, and most of this is accurate except for the single part. Here's what it thinks I'm interested in. Right? Computers, for some reason, PCs, which is kind of amusing. I haven't owned a PC in, I think, 16, 17 years. Cooking, obviously, interested in that. Home furnishings, right? We've moved a couple of times. I can understand why that is. Reading magazines. I don't read magazines. Camping and hiking. We just took a camping trip, as I alluded to. So my searches, right, and my purchases, and a variety of other things, including the GPS on my phone, feed this to allow for more and more accurate profiling of me. And here's what it says about my online purchases, aggregated from Amazon and other e-commerce sites. So you can see we made one large family purchase between $500 and $1,000 on the internet this year. It was actually an insurance purchase, but that's what it is. It has my total number of online dollars spent, the number of online purchases under 50 to 99, 100 to 250, 250 to 500. Right? And this is automatically aggregated. And just so you know how this is used, there's literally a software auction market that goes on when I visit a web page where someone may be bidding to get an ad about a new, Apple EarPod technology. And they want to find Caucasian men who live in the Washington, D.C. area, who have at least one large purchase on the internet, who are married, who have children, and who have some interest in technology. And in the milliseconds between when I request a page and when it's rendered to me, that auction system, right, competes, purchases, and serves an ad to me. So all of this privacy erosion that people are thinking about is in the service of that programmatic advertising market. And I work in the health space, and so this is sort of the question that we wrestle with. So here's a couple of marketing tools. I actually screen grabbed this from a marketing ad for the Internet of Things, and they literally call this my DNA. This is my consumer DNA. And this is my pivot into health, so you'll excuse me for being glib on it. But I think it's really important. In the service of frictionless, accurate advertising, we have given away a lot of these intersectional things that we think of as privacy. And we didn't even really realize that it was happening. It happened very quickly. It happened in one of those sort of exponential systems where you go, by doubling, you go from something that's trivial to something that's dominant in a very short number of generations. And now it's very hard to stuff this back in the bottle. And so in the health research context, this is what we wrestle with at SAGE, is how do we try to bring some of the capacity of this accuracy to something like health? Because in an ideal world, you would prescribe a drug to me that you think is going to work using the same methodologies. How do we get that benefit without bringing in the ethics culture? And it's already starting to happen. This is where you can find my genome on the internet if you're interested, at OpenSNP. So this is the beginning of using some of the same tools, cloud, wiki, but to make personal genome data available. And there are several thousand available at OpenSNP. It's been barred from using a variety of APIs that would let it import more by some of the data holders in the space. Because it's a little bit dangerous to have a database that erodes the trade secret benefit of the companies that are gathering those databases. That's the other sort of secret, is whether it's Facebook or Twitter or Google or 23andMe or whoever, the value comes from having a large enough scale that it looks like a commons if you're on the inside, but the walls are all the way around the edges. So you get some of the internal benefits of a commons or an open system, but they all happen inside the walled garden. Right, that's sort of the dirty secret of the cloud, is it lets walled gardens scale enough to start to mimic some of the properties of open systems. And this data is being used for research. So I don't like to beat up on Facebook. I actually like the fact that they're running these experiments, because how else could they be making decisions about their product except by trying to do academic experiments? By crucifying them, we've basically forced their research back inside where they don't publish it. Of course, they could do a better job in their terms of service and privacy policies, and I'll come back to that in a second. But research is starting to happen in different places, right? So not only is privacy fragmenting, research is starting to fragment, because research used to mean that you worked at a research university and you did research in a very structured sort of Vannevar Bush science, the endless frontier way. And that's fragmenting too under some of the same pressures. The funders are changing the rules of the research as well. So open access is something that everybody knows about. This is the Wellcome Trust most recent version of this. But it's not just publications. There's starting to be pressure from high-level politicians in the United States and the European Union to share the data rapidly. And you see in many cases the editors, the New England Journal of Medicine basically proposed a 5-year trade secret property right for those who generate human clinical study data, in response to the idea that this data needed to be shared more broadly. Right? That's not going to fly. It's not going to fly. The politicians are not going to listen to this. The NIH is not going to listen to this. And it's not just openness. A lot of it is enforcing collaboration. So this is a screen cap from the National Cancer Institute's new Centers for Systems Biology grant. And they've specifically funded a coordinating body to facilitate resource sharing, collaboration, and outreach activity across the network. Because it turns out that scientists haven't been trained on how to collaborate. They're fairly good at working inside the lab unit, but they're not very good at working lab to lab or 15 labs in a network. And what we're discovering is that you can't just throw 15 labs into a network and expect them to collaborate effectively. It's like throwing musicians from 15 jazz bands, right, ranging from Duke Ellington tuxedos we play off of the charts to crazy Miles Davis free jazz era. You can't just throw them together without a conductor and say, be a wind orchestra now. Right? So research is changing under all of these different kinds of pressures. There's openness pressures and there's collaborative pressures. And this is all just to sort of orient the experience that I'm going to be speaking from. Because what we do at SAGE is try to support research activities that contemplate the new, but integrate with the more traditional structures of research. This is the point at which I frequently disappoint if I'm giving a talk in Silicon Valley, because they're expecting me to go from that to, yay, disruption, blow it all up, right? And that's actually not my point, right? We need to be building bridges between the traditions of research and this sort of emerging technical wave. And I think that's really important, because the technical wave has the advantage of going into a system, at least in health, where the existing state of the art is so bad, right? It is so bad that even an incremental benefit is going to feel wonderful. It's going to feel like a breath of fresh air. And so my fear is that if we don't get this, that the amount of data that can be collected outside the quote-unquote research system is so much larger and so much faster and so analyzable that it will swamp what we consider the traditional health research system. And it'll swamp our ethics at the same time, just the way that it swamped us in social. And that's a big piece of what we're trying to work on. But we don't just work on the privacy thing. So let me just quickly show. We believe deeply in very basic library concepts, like you should write down what you do, and you should organize what you do in such a way that a third party can look at it and understand something about it. So we have a product we call Synapse. It's a cloud system. And basically it helps labs work together when they don't work together. But it's primarily about writing down what you're doing in a way that a third party can read it. What we've discovered, though, is that the cultural work is as important as anything. So the first thing we do with 2 labs is we ask them for their grant applications, and we look and we say, do you have specific aims that match other specific aims of someone else in the network? We get those 2 people talking and listing assets they can share with each other because they share a specific aim. And that's 95% of the work required to make that data useful for everyone else. But by localizing that incentive all the way down to a specific aim, we're actually able to make that happen. And as a nonprofit, nobody worries that we're trying to exploit this monetarily. To the extent that we get revenues, they're just revenues that cover our operating expenses and our Amazon fees. And this, after 7 years, has finally started to take root. The reality of working in the research world is that 7 years is like a PhD and a postdoc if you're going fast. And so it takes a long time to survive enough research cycles to show that this kind of thing works. But once it becomes evident that it does indeed work, the funders and the researchers begin to collapse on the solution pretty quickly. And so in case after case after case, by making these teams more collaborative in a closed or an open environment, they become more effective. But because they're working in a cloud environment, they can punch a button anytime they want and make the data set public if they have permission. Right? But the list of projects we have compared to the list of open projects we have is a depressing ratio because of a variety of fears about privacy. We are unable to make open the vast majority of the data that's being used in this collaborative way. What we've created is a network of clubs that you can try to join. It's not very satisfactory, although it is better than the state of the art. So we started working on challenges and contests and said, can these be a way to bring outsiders into the research process? And we work with a program called the DREAM Project, which was a joint venture of Columbia and IBM. Very, very sort of informatics, Bayesian model focused set of analytics. Went from 1 challenge or 2 challenges a year to 12 to 15. The most recent one, this digital mammography, actually has over $1 million worth of prizes. It's easily the biggest thing we've done. The goal being 90 to 95% of mammograms lead to false screening recalls that drive an enormous amount of cost. If we could even take 5 to 10% off the false positive rate, then we start to get some real work done. What we've learned in challenges is prizes are great. Openness is great, but it turns out if you make the challenges open from the very beginning, whoever's first at the very beginning, everyone iterates on their model. Whereas if you allow sort of a bohemia where people can compete in private and then submit at the end, and then what we do is we take the best features of all of the top models and combine them into a consensus model. The individual models are much more innovative and diverse in terms of the approaches that they take. And the consensus model that we put together out of all of the top entries has outperformed every individual model by an order of magnitude over and over and over again. So the way that you impose openness here is different. Now, again, we ran into another problem, which is there's just not very much human data we can use in these things, because the vast majority of the human data carries too much identifiable information, or it wasn't consented to be used and distributed in this manner. So either you have to come up with a really expensive cloud environment where the data scientists can reach their hands in with the gloves and manipulate the data without ever touching it, right? Or you have to make the data distributable. And so despite the fact that we felt really good about Synapse, we felt really good about the DREAM challenges, we realized that we weren't beginning to hit our mission, which was to try to change the entire research cycle, but part of that by bringing in actual individual people and by making the data more open so that we can run more challenges and have more open Synapse communities. And so, this is a question that we faced. if we were going to scale, we had to actually start doing our own research data gathering, because it became clear that the concepts and the philosophies that we had were not the ones that were traditional. I believe that my favorite comment from an Ivy League general counsel was most unusual, that we would want to make this data open afterwards. And so we had to basically become our own clinical research organization if we were going to start achieving our goals, by having these powerful systems we were creating start to be available to more people who were outside the traditional research system. So the first thing that we set as a hypothesis was that a research process can both be innovative and privacy protecting. Now, this is not about supporting privacy. It's about saying privacy is something that, even if it's a little intersectional or hard to define, in a given project, we can define what we mean by privacy and we can protect it. And we started in Parkinson's disease for a variety of reasons. A, we had great collaborators. We had scientists who were thinking about innovative ways to use the phone to measure some of the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. B, it's a disease that's really well fitted to the phone, right? So it just turns out that the sensors that do landscape versus portrait mode, if you capture them right, give you things like tremor. Right? If you put it into your pocket and you walk back and forth, we can tell your gait and your balance, right? And that was where we were able to start by saying, well, so that gives us a way to quantitatively measure things that have been qualitatively measured in clinic, by having a trained scientist or doctor eyeball you and say, today your gait is a 4 out of 5, or your muscle tone's a 10. And when we thought about a Parkinson's study, the largest study of symptom variation that had ever been run was about 1,800 people. For comparison's sake, they would all fit inside this church in Detroit. Now, think about Facebook's emotional contagion study. Their sample size was a hair under 700,000 people. So the sense was, maybe we can go to a larger group of people with a phone than 2,000, and maybe we'll learn something that you wouldn't learn under a normal study just because of sample size. And when we dug in deeper into the clinical protocol for that study, it wasn't just the sample size of 1,800, it was the sample frequency and the sample density. So they were only getting 1 in-person sample per year, they were only getting 2 phone samples per year, and the density of those samples was really limited. Now, when you went into the clinic, you got a really dense sample on that individual, but only once a year. And then all you got over the phone surveys was survey data, twice a year. And this is really, really thin data compared to what you can get through different kinds of technologies. So we worked with a group and we put together a battery of sensor activating tasks on the phone. And so tapping is a good example. When you would go to one of the doctors in a clinic, they would have you tap on the table and see, how many you could do in a minute. And they would eyeball it for the most part and give you a rating on a scale. And if they were really advanced, they'd videotape it and go back and count the taps, right? So they also wanted to do things like muscle tone. We could do that with phonation by having people say ah into the microphone. We get lung strength, but we also get from the quaver over time, we get your muscle tone over time. Walking, we have you put the phone in your pocket and walk, so we get balance and gait, a short memory activity. And what's remarkable is how much more information you can get about the illness as a lived experience. So instead of just the number of taps, these are just the first order features you get from a smartphone screen. So you get the number itself, but mean, median, minimum, maximum, standard deviation, any number of varieties that begin to access the different ways that people experience Parkinson's disease. So you start to find differences in the study, for example, where the 62-year-old man on the left is getting a clear benefit in number of taps from his drug, right, from L-Dopa, because you can also test him in the morning and the afternoon before and after the meds come in, so you can actually see the impact of the drug. On the right is an older woman, and what we see for her is she's actually getting a real clear benefit from L-Dopa, but it's not the number of taps, right? It's the accuracy of the tapping. So if we were only looking at the number of taps before and after L-Dopa, we would see no difference. But by being able to track the accuracy, we can infer that the L-Dopa is helping tremor. Because even if the raw numbers are the same, the accuracy of those taps has become significantly higher. And you see for any one individual, by doing this on a daily basis, you see the effect and the daily variation in the lived experience of the disease. So this is an individual taking L-Dopa. From left to right is the beginning of administration of medication. And what you can see is, a fairly steady benefit. The bottom of the line is before meds, the top of the line is after meds. Each of these vertical lines within the same day. And what you see is someone who was getting a clear benefit for a while, and then that benefit went sparse, like right in here. Right? The benefit of the drug becomes unclear. And this is an opportunity where you can say, what happened? Right? What changed in your life that the drug started becoming ineffective? Because what's clear is that you would never have seen this if you were only seeing the person once a year. You would never even know how much variation was going on. And so we also had these little screens where you can say, what has made you feel better in the last day? What's made you feel worse in the last day? And what we find is that, a lot of non-drug interventions really make people feel better who have Parkinson's disease. We know this about neurodegeneration. Stress and health have a huge impact on your life. What was interesting about what made people feel worse, pain, lack of sleep, mood, we have a persistent cluster that's really stressed out by race relations in the United States. We see keywords like Ferguson or Baltimore or race or the names of certain cable TV news networks on both sides. And so the more that people paid attention to certain kinds of news, the worse their quantitative sensor measured performance became. Now, we're not an FDA-approved medical device. We can't send notes back to people saying, hey, stop watching TV and go outside, right? But that's quite literally for a decent chunk of the population in the study, right? That's part of what you want to do. This is a pretty innovative study, and on top of that, we enrolled 25,000 people in it, right? With essentially no money for enrollment, just because we worked through earned media and the ability to recruit through the smartphone. Now, our engagement crashes over time as you watch it, as you might expect. It looks like any other app, in that people are really into it for 30 to 60 days, and then you have a hardcore of people who stay with it after that. But it's really interesting that you can do this kind of study without ever going through a regular research system. Now, we're not, this study wasn't federally funded, so we're not bound by the common rule from an ethics perspective. We're not a HIPAA-covered entity. So we could theoretically do almost anything we wanted with this data. Now, we have chosen to treat this data as if we are regulated by the common rule and HIPAA, and behave in a way that we protect the privacy of the individuals in the study. But we didn't have to, and that's an interesting point to remember. Anyone could have run the study, and they could have run it any way they wanted. They could have done anything that they wanted with the data. Now, taste is really important, and so learning not to collect things is really one of the most important lessons you can learn. So, Google knows I go to Seattle a lot. That's where Sage is located. I live in DC, so I telecommute. Google also knows I go to Knoxville, Tennessee a lot. This is where I grew up. My dad's been sick. I go back almost monthly. And so Google now knows what pizzas to predict that I should get coupons for in Seattle because of the frequency and regularity of that. So don't collect latitude and longitude unless you want to be creepy like Google. And if you want to share data in particular, don't collect data that goes beyond what you need. In Parkinson's, we want to collect GPS data. It's a really good secondary indicator of mobility and of mood. But we don't need to know where you go. We need to know how much you go. So instead of taking your latitude and longitude, we drop an encrypted pin on the phone at the registration, and what we collect every day is a vector of how far you went from that pin. And that allows us to start doing sharing things. Similarly, on the phonation, we could listen to your microphone while you make phone calls. That would be kind of creepy, right? It's a really good predictor of mood, believe it or not. Sighing and breathing, statistically, is a really good predictor of depression. But instead, we have you say, ah, right? We don't have you say the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog, because ah is not identifiable in a way that almost any other statement you could make is identifiable. So show taste if you're going to do this. So that's the innovation piece of this. So that, Todd's challenge to me again was, can we support both privacy and research? And I've just shown you the research side. So how do we deal with privacy? So this was in mid-2014. My group, which is overstating it at the time, my group was me and one other person. We had this Apollo 13 moment where they threw this app on the desk and they said, okay, how do you consent with this study where no one ever talks to anybody? Right, how do you actually enroll an IRB-approved, ethically non-dubious way to do this? And thankfully, we had some funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for this. But the biggest choice we made was actually not about law or ethics. It was treating this as a design problem. So instead of saying, how do we force the existing legal concepts into a phone in a way to meet the regulations, we said, can we actually run almost a software-style UX project where we try to understand ethnographically what people are thinking about from an informed consent perspective? Realizing that the power is shifting from sort of the doctor has all the information, controls all the information, to one where the participant in the study actually probably controls more data than the doctor controls at this point. Now, this is what came out of the ethnography, which is that basically that informed consent is totally broken. It was one of the most depressing sets of interviews I've ever been a part of, because every single person we talked to is like, man, informed consent's broken. Right? Comprehension, nobody understands the document, nobody reads the document, the language is terrible, nobody has time, the doctor doesn't have time to explain it, the nurse doesn't have time to explain it. It's in a document that's been in a file folder for 5 years, and we just keep running off copies of it, and you can barely even read it because of the Xerox degradation over time. And that was talking to the people who liked informed consent. The people who didn't like informed consent were saying, we hate doing this, but we have to stuff all the regulatory language in there to be compliant, and there's so much regulation and so many different regulations that you can't get under 5 pages and be compliant. And everyone's worried about liability. We interviewed IRB professionals who said, we would really like our job to be judging the studies on the merits, but we have to worry about whether or not an ethically sound study would get the university sued. Right? There are questions that you can't ask. Right, and things you can't say from a liability perspective. And so these were the sort of baseline consent problems, much less e-consent problems. And the way that I would summarize this is that there was a sense of technical debt in informed consent where everyone felt like it was broken and they needed to fix it, but no one was willing to go through the local effort of changing their protocols, of changing their default informed consent language, of moving away from the definitions their lawyers came up with 5 years ago. But what was good was that everyone wanted informed consent to work better. Right? Point 1 was the desperation. Point 2 was the hope. And if you're in a design space, this is exactly the kind of thing you want to come back. Most people were focusing on number 1 and not on number 2. But any solution that we came up with would have to float on top of the technical debt because no one was going to pay it. No one was going to change their documents, their forms. So we had to come up with something that could be part of the pedagogy but wouldn't require lots of local implementation work. We had a grant from AHRQ, the Alliance for Healthcare Research and Quality, which was through the Electronic Data Methods Forum, to actually run a series of workshops and do 25 interviews around this. And what we came up with was this model where we could essentially say the text layer, which is where all the technical debt and the legal debt and the IRB debt was, the technical document could actually float underneath an interface. And the interface could be designed solely to inform the participant. So this is, tiered information, pictorial dominant on one tier, text dominant on a navigation tier, and then a short assessment. I'll show you what this looks like. The reason we went to this was that on top of all the existing problems of regular consent, when you move consent onto a computer screen, you run into the fact that people don't read words the same way on screens as they do on paper. So a variety of marketing studies and consultant-run studies in web journalism found people read on average using eye gaze tracking 1 in 3 words on a screen compared to paper. But they think they read all of them, which explains a lot, right, about politics and news and culture, right? So this is problem A, which is almost like a physical problem. Problem B is that we've become acculturated as a society to just clicking OK on the terms of service. This is from a couple of years ago, and it was a cafe in London that had a Herod clause for your firstborn child in return for access to the Wi-Fi that everybody signed. In case you think this is a joke, right, I'll broadcast it. It was after I gave my slides up here, but I found this morning a preprint from late August that they reran this experiment with about 543 individuals. 98% clicked OK on terms of service that included an explicit commitment to deliver your data to the NSA. right? And the firstborn child was in there too. 98%, right? The average time spent reading the privacy policy was 73 seconds. At a normal human reading rate of 250 words a minute, it should have been 30 minutes. So you have to build something that doesn't expect people to actually read the document, which is scary, right? But that's where we are. And people don't read the document anyway. So what we came up with was, based on some of the research that we found from web journalism, which was that an on-task picture slows down eye gaze movement to the same pace as reading in print. Doesn't work with an off-task picture. It has to be an on-task picture. And the theory is that it's the amount of cognitive load required to balance the headline to the picture that slows you down. And so if you've ever wondered why photograph, headline, subheadline is such a common framework on the internet and on the phone, it's because it slows your eyes down and makes you think. Now, the subheadline is almost always, and you won't believe what happened next, right? But we figured we could hijack the same sort of sociology behind that design and use it from an informed consent perspective. So let's come up with essential clinical concepts, let's come up with on-task pictures, and let's give each of those pictures a headline and a subheadline, and then we'll see how that goes. This is where we started. After the workshop and some design and some actual professional designers, we went to this, and then what we wound up with in the final design was this. And so for each of these, we have the visual space, we have the headline, the subheadline, and then the learn more takes you to a 5th to 6th grade summary of the concept. Now, this is not the language that's necessarily in the consent form, although the consent form is accessible at multiple places. These are the concepts that the group of ethicists, clinical professionals, and IRB professionals agreed needed to be conveyed for someone to give informed consent to enroll in the study. So the screen is structured very deliberately to not allow you to get distracted, so there's a lot of white space. We've broken it up into these areas so that you can repurpose these for different reasons. The navigation reinforces the concept, so if you click on learn more about data processing, by definition, that's what you want to know more about. So you can only go back to the data processing screen. By forcing you to go back, you have to look at the picture again. We reactivate the cognitive effort to connect the picture to the headline. Just as a note, like, you kind of need to be careful the way you choose icons. So we could have chosen privacy with like a happy, friendly thing, like, yay, we're protecting you, with like a lock. But that's not what we want to convey. What we want to convey is there's a tension between privacy and advancing research in this way. And rather than sort of make a promise of absolute privacy to you, we get the big red hand, which is a pretty universal sense of stop and think. So the icon design really affects whether or not you are putting your thumb on the scale to make promises or whether or not you're trying to warn people. This is a methodology that can be abused, right? That's why I wanted to point this out. Is we're spending a lot of time with the IRB community now trying to help them understand how they need to review these kinds of protocols. Because if you use this UX methodology to obscure information, you're not exactly advancing the cause of informed consent. And what you wind up with is a study narrative. And some of that is stable, your rights, some potential risks and benefits, and some of this changes study by study. But the concept was that privacy isn't just eliminating some sort of risk of identification. Privacy is something that we need to let everyone decide what they think they're comfortable with by giving them as much information as possible, balanced to the expected risks of the study. Now, we don't want you to just be able to swipe right into the study, which is a danger. So in all of the studies that we support, you have to go through a short quiz and get a perfect response on it. Now, if you fail, you go right back to the beginning of the consent loop. That's suboptimal. When we launched this in sort of March of 2015, we didn't know how well it would work. So we didn't collect data in advance of consent. We didn't collect metrics on where people bailed out. We didn't collect demographics because if we did this wrong, we wanted to minimize the harm. We're moving now, as we've seen some success in this, to start collecting those metrics to say, where do people bail out? Where do people click learn more? People who fail, what were their clicking patterns like in the consent structure? So that we can start to make this more and more accurate. But that's really just starting to happen now. We're an open source organization, so we released all of this as a toolkit under, at most, attribution licenses. Most of what we do in this context is in the public domain. We build on the knowledge tiers. We create heuristics that make it easy to take and adapt this. We've open sourced the icons that we've used and collected from across the net. So we have hundreds and hundreds of icons that are either CC BY or public domain, representing key clinical concepts. We have PowerPoint templates. We actually recommend people communicate with their IRB in PowerPoint rather than trying to encode it in software. Because by doing designs at this level, it's easy to do the editing before you hand it off to the developer. So we've actually got a template you can download that has the mobile phone picture. It has all of the pieces in place that you can do your own designs without any sort of bespoke software. Right, we have actually the design layouts, the actual design layouts that our designers built. So these are available as Adobe Illustrator files, so you can open them up and go right in and start hacking on them. Software workflows. App developers don't know that you can't start collecting data the minute the phone is installed, the app is installed on the phone. And so if you don't produce these kind of workflows and you have a contractor, they will do things like come back and go, hey, we simplified things and the app starts collecting data as soon as it's downloaded now. Right? Or they'll say things like, man, you were just asking for age. We put in birthday so you can give them a happy birthday note. And you're like, no, right? You only had the first 3 digits of zip code. What's wrong with you? And so these software workflows help you communicate contextually with your development team because they've probably been trained outside the context of the regulated sphere. And then web templates and assets. A lot of the concept was that if someone wanted to stand up the kind of study that we did, we wanted to maximize the odds that they did so ethically. And so a lot of people don't think about the fact that your website is the equivalent of the advertisements in the clinic or on the subway or wherever you're recruiting. And so by making open source photographs, open source template frameworks and layouts, it would make people realize, oh, I probably should have a section on how the study works. And I probably should have a section on who's eligible to participate and who's running the study. Because those are regulatory requirements when you're communicating. But by creating templates that we give away, the hope was that we could get people acculturated to doing things right, even though they might not realize that what they were doing was doing things right. And then the last thing in the context of supporting both research and privacy was around sharing. Now, I'm sort of known as a sharing guy. I've been labeled an absolutist in some senses, and sometimes I am. But I believe pretty deeply that letting people be in charge of the sharing decisions is a good idea, but this has been hard to do in health data. It's relatively easy to do in copyright. The copyright comes down from God when I pull up my fingers from the keyboard, right? And then I can use a CC license or I can not use a CC license, right? It's easy. In health data, it's hard. So we've enrolled about 88,000 people across the SAGE-supported studies in about 18 months. 75% of them ticked a box that says, Sage, you do not get to keep this data in a silo. I want you to share it with qualified researchers worldwide. Now, this is biased. These people who already enrolled in a clinical study, so obviously they're going to be more altruistic than the general population. But the desire to share stuff is a fairly stable feature of populations. It doesn't tend to grow or drop dramatically. The number of people who edit Wikipedia is relatively stable, even as the number of users scale. The percentage of developers who work in open source, right, is one that mainly changes through funding than one that changes through politics. But my belief is that we're gonna settle in somewhere between 40 and 60% of people who are willing to be in a study are in the study because they want knowledge to be created, and therefore they're going to want that data as useful as possible if they feel comfortable. So this is the option where they could choose that, right? So only share my data with Sage and its partners, or share it with Sage and qualified researchers worldwide. They can edit this setting whenever they want. But what's interesting is neurodegeneration, breast cancer, melanoma, heart disease, asthma, football player health, right? On and on and on, 75%. Somewhere between 68 and 80% stable chooses this option. We didn't know how many people would choose this. And so we actually decided to do a secondary research project on, well, what should we define as a qualified researcher? Should we say that you're only a researcher if you're at an academic institution? No, because as it turns out, if Pfizer wants access to it, they'll give Harvard money, and the Harvard researchers will go access the data and hand their results back to Pfizer. Right? Similarly, a lot of rare disease organizations work with for-profit corporate partners because no academic will study their disease because it's not important enough to lead to a publication. So putting in a nonprofit requirement would have chilled a lot of the research that we want to chill, and it would be a false promise. One of the biggest things that we worry about is making fake promises to people. And sort of saying nonprofit only is a fake promise. It's not a promise that gives people what they actually want, which is protection. You can either have protection from the innovation, or you can have the innovation plus some risk. We also didn't want to say that you would have to be some sort of accredited researcher. There are smart people all over the world, and we wanted to find a way to get access to those individuals. So first of all, we let everyone download their own data, which is what you see. What we came up with was an additional information loop before you could make that choice, where you say, your data is available. In addition to this, it can be used for other research, and you get to decide whether or not it gets used for other research. Now, a qualified researcher, we came up with rules to qualify researchers, which I'll show you in a second. But we made a point that we don't control the research they do with the shared data. In a lot of cases, data use committees, data access committees vet the individual and the use. We've decided to split those in much the same way that PLOS has split up with PLOS 1, the impact which emerges over time from the validity of the study, the perceived impact. So by splitting these up, we say that we're going to qualify researchers, but we're going to allow all sorts of different kinds of research uses. And of course, we de-identify the data that we're going to make available. Now, what we do, and this was inspired by me standing in line in customs because the global entry machines were broken, thinking, I can't believe I can use global entry to get in and out of the United States, and I can't use it to get in and out of a database. So the idea was that researchers would have to reveal their identities to the world, because we know that, and I'm a big fan of anonymity in a lot of ways, but if you want to access my personal data, it's not a big thing to ask you to reveal your identity as a default. Now, everything I'm going to show you has an exception. So if you are worried that your research will endanger you, right, we can make an exception. But as a general rule, we want the researchers to identify themselves. We want them to pass a test. So we actually wrote, in conjunction with a genetic counselor, an ethics and technology test that you have to pass. It's not an overly burdensome one, but if you're a troll, these two requirements alone significantly reduce the odds that you're going to go through with the process. We make you file a data use statement, says what you're going to do with the data. And we reject a lot of those, not because of scientific merit, but because of incompleteness. But we don't really care what your science project is, as long as you've described it well enough that we feel like you have a sense of what you're doing. And then we also make you sign an oath. So you have to download, print, and sign and initial, scan, and upload this oath, using some of the same UX concepts from the informed consent. We know, for example, from legal documents that making you initial next to things increases the odds that you read them. So we've brought that in. We've collapsed this down to a single-page grid. And again, just the transaction cost of doing this, as well as the sociology of making you think about it, we're trying to reduce the number of people that would just casually violate and be jerks. Because the vast majority of trespasses come from lack of care and lack of attention. Right? And so the number of people who are willing to go through with ID validation, oath, pass the test, file a data use statement, these are not together barriers to any reasonably motivated researcher. But they are barriers to a lot of the predictable abuses of the data. And then, of course, we feed back the names of the participant and the data use statements back to the people that are enrolled in the study that chose to share, so they can decide whether or not to adjust their settings based on how the data is getting used. We've published the first batch of shared data. So this is about 10,000 people's data. We published the first 6 months of their Parkinson's data earlier this year. As a test of the framework, we now have 7 other studies in the queue where we're shaping the data up to publish them under the same framework. We have a little over 100 qualified researchers on every continent except Antarctica, using the data for everything from Parkinson's disease to just doing basic Bayesian methods validation on how to analyze mobile clinical study data. This is what the disease portal looks like, so you can go in and get the description. You can look at the research community. You can look at the publications that have come out of it. And so where we're going now is where we think the puck is going. This is good for assessing what we know that's low risk. So philosophically, it means it's data that we understand more or less the risks and benefits. Not all data is data where we understand the risks and benefits. So for things like electronic health records and DNA, right? The vast majority of the true benefits and the true risks are emergent. They will be discovered by doing research. And so it's a very different method for teaching and assessing this than this pedagogy that we've shown. Now, there are some things that we can do with it in the context of like health records, right? And I've got that middle finger icon as a placeholder. But the number one predictable, right, misuse of electronic health record data is going to be trolling, doxing, and bullying. Right? It's very unlikely that Aetna is going to use your EHR data to discriminate against you. That would be dumb of Aetna. Right? Aetna would much rather discriminate against you using an actuarial table derived from lots of aggregate data than to go after you as an individual. So the biggest risk we have to educate people on is, let's say, I live in a building, right? We have a pool. Let's say that I have a sexually transmitted disease, right? And it's in my EHRs, and someone in the building doesn't like me, right? That's the kind of thing that posting on our Facebook page would do a pretty significant harm to me because they wanted to keep me out of the pool. This hasn't happened to me, thankfully. I don't have an STD, and I live in a building that's very nice, but this is something that has happened. I get a lot of phone calls about weird privacy cases, and this is not a hypothetical one. How do you communicate to people weird concepts like ETL, right? Transfer and extraction, right? What's the state of the data in transfer? Like, are we going to give people like 60 screens? I don't know, because we're going to have information overload even with this kind of user interface. How do you talk about risks to people? Right? We have this culture of making zero-sum statements about privacy, right? Zuckerberg, privacy is dead, right? People who have companies that promise privacy. Privacy is fine, right? The answer is complicated, which is, because of the more data you give, the more accurate the study gets, but the more identifiable you become, right? Benefits, right? The open data movement is good at talking about very high-level benefits. It's not very good about talking about tangible benefits to individuals. If you're going to propose a benefit to an individual, you've got to be pretty sure that it exists. And your rights are very fragmented depending on where you live in this country and where you live across the world. Your rights, the rights of individuals to not do certain things, are fragmented and difficult to understand. And so a big part of what we're doing now is looking for inspiration. And I'm going to go through 4 crazy ideas that we have for how to inform people and assess them that don't look at all like what I just showed. And so these are going from the left to the right, from the lowest interaction required up to the highest interaction required. And this is where thinking about things with designers, with like actual designers, comes in really handy, because they get you out of doing it the same way you've always done it. So one method would be to sort people as they come into research based on their projected privacy risk. So if their genome was really unique, they would have a higher privacy risk than someone whose genome was really not unique. There's no such thing as a really not unique genome, as it turns out. But this is the theory, right? You could sort people into high and low risk and consent them differently, so that people who were low risk could go through something like I just showed you. People who were high risk could get routed into some sort of synchronous conversation with a counselor who can help them make a choice. And this is, very popular on the technocratic side of things, because it projects the idea that we will be able to use algorithms to sort people into high and low risk groups. I'm not convinced that's true, but I'm not willing to throw this out as a metaphor yet, because it does have the power to scale, which is nice. Ballot box is a really interesting metaphor. So this would be, rather than trying to figure out, does John understand what de-identification is? Right? Give John 10 statements about de-identification and have him drag them to parts of the screen that indicate comfort or discomfort. And then you can say, 9 out of the 10 statements you dragged to a discomfort area. Are you sure you want to move forward with this? And this is really valuable because it gets at sort of the lizard brain, right? And because one of the biggest problems we have is people, because of social desirability bias or other things, people want to be in research with their forebrain, but their lizard brain is scared to death. And so finding ways to get at that lizard brain and then surface that are what we mean by the ballot box. First game I ever played was called Colossal Cave Adventure. It's famous for the "you are in a long, narrow corridor" opening. This is another one we're looking at, is especially on a phone, you have limited real estate. So could you have something that is inspired by a game? So this is not gamifying. It's quite literally taking a design lesson from the game itself to say we're going to have to navigate an environment. And by navigating the environment, you'll demonstrate informedness, or at least comfort with complex concepts. And then this is my favorite one in many ways. I'm not a Star Trek person, but when we did our ethnography, one of the people was a Trekkie. And what they came up with was Kobayashi Maru. This is a test in Star Trek that can't be won. Right? It's a battle where no matter what you do, everyone dies. And it's famous in Star Trek because Captain Kirk hacks the computer to win, right? He's the only one who ever wins it. But the idea here is, can you present complicated scenarios where there are no right answers and provoke the participant to actually answer and play the role of a study coordinator or an ethicist, right? Or a clinician, or even themselves. But no matter what their answer is, they don't get back a check that says, ding, you're right, you're in the study. They get back a set of contextual information that shows the problems with whatever choice they made, and let them play it as many times as they need to. And so the whole idea behind all of these is to begin thinking very broadly about how do we teach people about research and their place in it so that they can decide whether or not there's a balance that justifies participation. And we're starting from a gulf where the vast majority of individuals are carrying around very powerful sensing and computing devices and are utterly disconnected from the research enterprise and the ethics enterprise. And so, I hope if I've sort of conveyed anything, it's that there's hope and there's possibility here, but it takes a lot of design. It's not going to happen just by doing the things the way that we already have. So to finish, right, the reason I wasn't willing to run away is I actually think the answer is that it is possible to support both of these things. But it has to be intentional, right? It has to be purposeful. If we just port analog privacy processes into digital research systems, the digital is going to eat the analog. And so we have to take a design inspiration, right? Because the people that are taking away privacy are using design, right? There's a reason why the privacy settings in social networks are set the way they are, and there's a reason why they're placed on the screen where they are, right? Every piece of that is A/B tested and designed. And if we don't have the same philosophy in research, it's going to be very hard to support research and privacy at the same time. And as a general rule, I think what will happen is that research will become the domain of companies that exist at scale to collect data at scale. And it will rapidly be taken away from those of us who actually spend our lives thinking about whether we're doing this right or wrong. So purpose, intent, and design are tools. And if we don't use them, then I think the answer to this question is going to be no. But if we do use them, I think the answer can be yes. So that's my uplifting ending. Thank you very much for having me. And I've got a few minutes for questions before I have to take off for the airport. Thanks.
Thank you, John. So, questions, discussions, where can we take some of John's ideas and implement some of them? Chris?
John, you always scare me by the end of the day. Let me test something out on you, because and you won't unfortunately be here when I talk later about what we're doing with data governance at UCLA. Part of where we ended up was to say notice and consent, which are the traditional fair and patient practices around privacy, are necessary but no longer sufficient, which is part of what you're saying. And we're trying to deal with these use cases with great difficulty. But can you go back up the food chain? You're working just in medicine. We're trying to do even a broader, scarier thing. How do we adapt these 1960s era notice and consent and flip it to say necessary but not sufficient, and start focusing on uses rather than on the origins of getting in the first place?
I don't know. I mean, if I had an answer, I would probably still be in DC writing a white paper for the transition on that topic. FIPS is, Fair Information Practices, FIPS is very popular, but a lot of it to me is because there's no informed requirement, right? So by having simply the execution of the legal document under the Uniform Commercial Code qualify, we've created this culture where, the white paper I referenced is called The Biggest Lie on the Internet. And the biggest lie is I agree to the terms and conditions of this website. And so to me, the thing that as I go up the food chain, I think the answer is inform and assess. right? If we had even a 1,000th of the design resources that go into making you give your data away, pushed into making you understand where your data goes, I think it would have a transformational effect. Part of why I go around preaching the talk that I just preached is to try to point out that informedness is achievable, right? Including using technology, because a lot of people despair of that. And you know, I've not been invited back to most of the large Silicon Valley places where I've given this talk because of that, I think. And because what you find is when you inform people, I mean, a lot of them I think will still make the same deal. Like I still use Facebook, I still use, you know, Twitter, and shop on Amazon and use credit cards and loyalty cards. But I'm very cognizant of where things go, and I think the fear is that this would be throwing sand into the gears of the industrial internet economy if we actually made people be informed and assessed on their informedness. But that's one of the things that I think starts to chip away at the problem. But yeah, I mean, everyone I talk to tends to feel like notice and consent is broken. There's disagreement on what else to do. You know, my bias is I really think that, and this shows my own career bias. I think that letting me have my own copy of my own data, free and clear, is another thing that fixes a lot of stuff. So I don't believe in putting me into the middle of every decision about my data, but I think having a copy that cannot be locked up as a trade secret erodes a lot of the other sort of power structures that I think are a little toxic. But so it was a very long-winded and non-declaratory answer. I apologize.
John, thank you very much. Lisa Hinchliff at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I'm wondering if you can add any reflections here on what I'm going to call timeline questions. So, like, it seems like we opt into Facebook once, and then, you know, we've made a decision of informed consent or not at one point in time. And I'm wondering, as you've thought about this in the research context, whether you think it's important for people to, if you will, reaffirm their consent if these are longer-term projects. And if so, how often? And does that have, I mean, I'm thinking about the fact that people, even in traditional IRB kind of things, you know, if you are under 18, we have certain parameters, but at some point you're going to be over 18, maybe shortly. And similarly, protected subjects that then, if you're in a prison population, so you're, over time, if you're doing longitudinal research, your subjects are actually changing status as well. So just to make it a little more complicated. So your thoughts on timeline?
It's a great question. So we're part of the Precision Medicine Initiative at SAGE, so I actually co-chair the consent working group for the PMI. And I think that the PMI is going to be one of the places where we start to be able to answer these questions. You know, the longest study we've got at SAGE is 18 months. We haven't had a lot of experience dealing with actual longitudinal large cohort populations. We have excluded most of the edge cases that are difficult, like children and prison populations and things, people without phones, people with low literacy. But the PMI doesn't do a lot of excluding. So I think we'll be able to look at that over time. There's all sorts of difficult. This is why I'm here, right? I don't normally travel to be at Sunday meetings, but like this interest group is sort of the privacy metadata that Todd alluded to in the introductory slides. Like those are some of the ways that we're going to need to be able to deal with some of these things. Because what we don't want to do is develop bespoke stuff with engineers who don't really understand the research side of things. As a hack, because hacks that get embedded into otherwise successful systems tend to become permanent infrastructure. You know, and I live in DC, right? The terminals C and D at Dulles, those are temporary structures since 1985 or so. And so being able to have metadata about these data sets that can start to tag those kind of constraints about individuals is the example of the kind of thing that would help us start to solve that problem. That plus just experience. Another reason to sort of be humble and open and transparent is that as mistakes get made, because mistakes get made in research, right? That's not going to change. But if you can sort of say, here's what we're trying to do and how we're trying to do it, and here are the kinds of mistakes we expect to make, you have a lot more tolerance when those mistakes happen because you're ready for them and you have a system that's ready to deal with them. You know, We're going to have to deal with the fact that kids use their parents' phones to enroll in things, right? We're going to have to deal with the fact that most of the identity validation processes that would prevent a kid from using their parents' phone violate the kid's privacy, right? That's one of my favorite conundra that's out there, is the thing that would protect the privacy through identity validation requires breaking privacy to do identity validation. And I don't have a good solution to it. But that is a question that is being asked weekly in the consent working group for PMI, I can tell you.
So thanks a lot, John. That was very interesting. Can I ask you another timeline question? So in terms of the pragmatics of this, so in the UK, for example, there's enough, when I do my talk later on, I'm going to talk about some of the ways that we're dealing with some of these issues in relation to our big cohort studies. But it seems to me that both you and Todd earlier on, and I definitely agree, note that there is extremely rapid evolution, not only of the potential technology, but also of the social understanding, both of the professional population and the general population. And I wonder to what extent we should try to find an ideal solution now and try to move to it rapidly, because it's quite likely it's going to have to shift anyway, and that whether we would be better off trying to do the best we can, exactly as Todd mentioned earlier on, taking account of all the information that knowledge we do have at the moment, but sort of somehow in partnership with the community, acknowledge that we are feeling our way and that it will take time to get where we ultimately get to.
Yeah, I don't think that we're anywhere close to having a good enough solution to say this is the solution. You know, data's weird because there are ways that data looks like a financial asset. There's ways that data looks like a public good. There's ways that it looks like a trade secret or property. And in most cases, we don't manage our own financial assets or trade secrets or other things. We have systems for that. Like I keep my money in the bank, and in my ideal world, what we will see is locally appropriate, contextually appropriate organizational solutions, which is necessarily going to have more diversity. I came into all of this from sort of the digital commons, scalable licenses, and as I've gotten farther into data, I'm going farther back in the commons to Ostrom and organizational solutions as opposed to legal solutions. Because people trust SAGE that enroll in the studies with their data, and we try to earn that through transparency and other means. But it's only because we keep their trust that they stay with us as an institution. And if you look at the role that conservation land trusts and community land trusts played in the environmental movement in the 60s and the 70s, I think there's an interesting potential parallel. Trusts have all sorts of issues, especially with indigenous property rights and so forth, but the idea that I could be in, I have a sister with autism and a sister with arthritis, I could put a copy of my data into an arthritis trust and an autism trust and let them manage it for those purposes for me, and I wouldn't have to worry very much about it. And then that trust would give me back the returns on the investment, which would ideally be knowledge or knowing where to go for treatment, whether or not a drug would work for me or not. If I were a quantified self person, I could put my data in something like a real estate investment trust and say, build condos on my data, but give me money back. And if I were part of a conservative group, I could say I want my data in a conservation trust, and I only want it accessed in case of national emergency or tribal emergency or what have you. Those aren't as appealing in the current sort of mental context, because we like sort of quasi-monopolies at network scale right now. That's what's cool. And what I'm proposing is like the anti that, right? It's much more like going back to like web rings or something, but, of data. Because when you dig into privacy, because everyone is so different about it and everyone feels differently in different contexts, right? If I'm in control of my own copy of my data, if there are certain uses of that data that are constrained because we know that they're toxic, right? Environmentally toxic, right? Certain kinds of re-identification or discrimination based on re-identification. That's sort of where I feel more comfortable, is like, let's set some barriers of what we all agree is bad and make those criminal, right? Through legislation, regulation, through the courts. And then let's let the system for managing the non-bad flows evolve, but trying to prioritize organizational solutions and organizational oversight, organizational governance, right? Because the other thing about the tech stacks is they're not just giant monopolies, they're ungovernable. You know, I mean, like a company like Google is almost ungovernable with the existing United States methodology or EU methodologies, right? We just don't have we don't have the legislation in place to govern them, and we can't even pass a budget. We can't pass Zika funding. And so, you know, that's the other benefit of having sort of an organizational approach is if we make those organizations governable and accountable as a first pass, then there's actually a potential lever for the public interest if the system gets out of whack, right? But I'm very nervous about over-engineering a solution because the amount of capital available to benefit from surveillance almost guarantees that it'll find a way around anything we declare as a solution.
Matthew Ketterling, Colorado School of Mines. How about, say, I think I see with, you're right here, and I see your, with Sage that, okay, if I'm going to go and take a survey, you're here and I know you, but what about copycats and that sort of thing? How do we know in general that an app you download, you know, is a, you know, legit company?
That's a great question.
Or positive environment. Like, I think it just kind of dilutes the whole internet.
Yeah. And this is an irony, again, there's a lot of ironies in open systems, right? So the irony is that Apple, which has the closed app store, has more power to fix that than Google, which has the open app store. So Apple is systematically tightening its app developer guidelines around health-related data to where they're starting to say we're going to delete your app if it's generating bad data or bad clinical data. So they have the power. If you're going to do a research study, it's got to have IRB approval. Now, I'd like to see them tighten those screws further and require the protocol be posted on the page in the iTunes store where you download the app. I'd rather have some external organization providing a good housekeeping seal of approval or rating. I'd love to see that, but who knows? Google, it's much harder to see how the Android App Store does that because that's not in their culture. But my general bias is that trademark approaches are probably the highest scale possibility. We have the Good Housekeeping and the Better Business Bureau seals of approval, and we probably need something similar to this. But there's going to be an interstitial period where bad actors look like good actors. And I don't know any other way around that except to acknowledge it and admit it and design systems that are as attuned to those as possible and crushes those bugs as quickly as possible. And I apologize, I just got my flight reminder, so I need to go. I have a 5-year-old and school's closed tomorrow. My wife is flying to Geneva in the morning, so I have to be back on the East Coast today. But I really wanted to be here. Please don't hesitate to follow up with me individually, through Twitter, anything else. Criticism is the most important feedback you can give me. So thanks for having me and have a great week.
Great. Thank you, John. And that was and thank you so much for making the time to come and for joining us and giving your insight. So we have a bit of a break. I think we want to, we were off by about 15 minutes, but fortunately we had a half-hour break and we can still keep it to a 15-minute break. I think that's enough. So we'll reconvene at, 11:15? I just don't have my, that's what it says on the agenda. For those of you who are listening on the live stream, in order to keep the files manageable for the recording, well, what I think we'll do is just kill the live stream for just a minute and then restart it so that we have an hour-and-a-half video as opposed to a 6-hour video. So if you're on the live stream, it'll disappear for a minute, but reload, it'll come back. So with that, have some coffee. We will reconvene in about 15 minutes. Thanks.